Good evening. Welcome to the Hand of History. I'm Johnny Mercier. Today, we're going to look at the high points of the Revelation chapters 6 and 7. There's a lot to examine in the Revelation between chapters 4 and 22, and we will do so in time. For now, my purpose is to address the questions that most people already have. This is going to go longer than usual, so grab a cup of coffee and get comfortable. We already covered the four horsemen of the apocalypse, but I wanted to go back and clear up verse 6 of chapter 6. Verse 6 is a reference to the law as defined in Ezekiel 45, 9-15. Unjust balances, cheating on the portion of oil, and bringing blemished and even weakling and crippled stock and crooked balances into the marketplace, and the abuse of tenants and debtors, as described in Micah 2:2, were all condemned throughout the entire journey from Exodus to the captivity, and Jesus called the money changers thieves who had turned his house into a house of merchandise and a den of thieves. These are all crimes of greed. The prescribed measure of wheat and barley to be provided by each household was 1 penny's worth. The oil was apparently to be provided by the priests. This voice, heard in the midst of the beasts, was that of Jesus, whip in hand, clearing the merchants and the money changers out of the temple. On to chapter 7. Chapter 7 is written not only for Gentiles in general, but seems to be directed almost specifically to latter-day Gentiles, as much of the content of this chapter can only be deciphered with the benefit of hindsight. There's a lot of history in this chapter. Few of the people involved as players in the making of that history, maybe only one or two, were likely conscious of the fact that they were involved in the fulfilling of prophecy. There is no evidence that any of the world's onlookers were aware of it. Certainly no one wrote anything that would suggest such awareness. But we have those histories and can quite accurately decipher the meaning of chapter 7 by using them. Use of the word angels, as we've discussed previously, is not describing otherworldly beings with wings and such. Mostly in the case of future prophecy, angels are just the best method of describing persons that the prophet had no way of identifying or naming. John wrote this work roughly 1900 years ahead of its time, and none of the nations involved would even exist for another 800 to 1,000 years after John had gone on to his reward. He would have had no way of envisioning Europe in general, much less the individual nations, and even less yet individual human beings. So these angels are not great holy beings dispatched from the presence of the Lord to carry out these acts and make these pronouncements. They are just descriptions of the human beings who would be doing so. Chapter 7, verse 1. And after these things I saw 4 angels standing on the 4 corners of the earth, holding the 4 winds of the earth, that the wind should not blow on the earth, nor on the sea, nor on any tree. Do you have your list of prophetic rules handy? We can add a couple of items here. Of course, the earth is a globe and doesn't have corners. This is just another way of saying the 4 points of the compass. Wind refers to war. The 4 winds spoken of here is simply saying that war coming from any direction on the earth was being held back. Seas are people and languages, trees are individual nations, and the earth in this context is referring to basically uninhabited landmass. In other words, for a time, war in general on the face of the earth would be held in check. The four angels are pretty easy to identify, as is their method of holding the four winds. The angels are British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, Italian Premier Vittorio Orlando, French Premier Georges Clemenceau, and President of the United States Woodrow Wilson, the primary power brokers in the negotiations of the Versailles Treaty, which was not peace, as a rational person would ideally use that word, but it was an armistice that managed to keep the world basically free of open shooting hostilities, war, for 20 years' time. Verse 2, "And I saw another angel ascending from the east, having the seal of the living God, and he cried with a loud voice to the four angels to whom it was given to hurt the earth and the sea, saying, Hurt not the earth, neither the sea, nor the trees, until we have sealed the servants of our God in their foreheads." The language, the use of words in verse 2 is cool. While using a style of verbiage that forces you to pay attention and to think, if you are doing so, it tells you everything you need to know, short of giving you the guy's name. Or perhaps I should say names, because I'm going to take a liberty and say that this angel is actually two men speaking with one voice, as it were. The first and obvious candidate is David Ben-Gurion. But since the verse stresses the use of a loud voice, I'm including Eliezer ben Yehuda, the man who raised the Hebrew language from the dead. These two were the primary locomotives in Israel's ascent to statehood. Verse 2 is speaking of the span of time from 1882 to 1939. As a British protectorate, Palestine was opened to establish a homeland for the displaced Jews of the diaspora. 1889 is when Palestine began to see notable numbers of Jews relocating to these cities of refuge. Jerusalem and Bethlehem were protected resettlement zones for the Jews, and Tel Aviv became the first all-Jewish city in the history of the Common Era. There are actually two angels that spoke with one voice, as it were, in this window of time. David Ben-Gurion, who, with the political vision of Theodore Herzl and others, became the most notable founding father of the new Israel. And Eliezer ben Yehuda, who virtually single-handedly revived Hebrew, at that time a dead language, as a spoken language and its exclusive use as the language of the Jewish national rebirth. Sometime, please read Joel chapter 2:30 through chapter 3, verse 1. Isaiah chapter 10:20 to 25, and Zephaniah chapter 3, verse 9. You'll find those interesting. 1933 to 1936 were the peak of Jewish emigration to Palestine in this era. But after 1936, opposition, politics, riots, and the increasing tensions leading up to World War II brought about a decline in immigration and the doors began to close on the opportunity promised to Isaiah, Joel, and in numerous other places about the safety to be found in Jerusalem. In 1939, the doors were closed once and for all. Please read Matthew chapter 22, verses 1 to 14. When it says the angel ascended from the east, it doesn't mean the east as in the Orient. It means east of where the other four angels were meeting and east of where they all lived, or east by their perspective. These two men both obviously had the seal of God. They were on an ascent, and both were looking for servants of God to seal in their foreheads with the mark of citizenship. Verses 5 to 8 make it obvious that this angel was Jewish. Who else on this earth and in this world would have undertaken such a mission? Everyone else had always been out to destroy Israel, not to provide them with a seal of safety and refuge. Verse 4, and I heard the number of them that were sealed, and there were sealed 144,000 of all the tribes of Israel. This is an interesting prophecy, isn't it? The pronouncement of this prophecy certainly required some moxie. Not only to pronounce a number some 1900 years in advance of the event, but for that number to be such a small number. There are several problems to be solved in this particular verse, which have just been passed over or ignored by pretty much everybody. If you don't acknowledge a problem, it doesn't really exist, right? But of course, we don't do things that way, because problems are clues. The primary problem with this statement is that it's too simple, too tidy, too perfect, and too uniform. The second problem is that you see references to multiples in several places in the Revelation, referring to different types of measure: populace, cubits, rods, height, depth, and square volume. Yet, all are multiples of 144. The final problem is not really in the text itself, but what people have done with the text. That being the silly Gentile notion that there will only be 144,000 Jews in heaven. There are even people who believe there will only be 144,000 people all told in heaven. To begin with, this text is not even speaking of heaven, as that word is generally thought of and used. It is speaking of a gathering of Jews into the land of Palestine, obviously to provide them refuge and succor, a safe haven from the coming persecution of the Holocaust. The first problem can be pretty accurately solved by the exercise of about 2 minutes of the effort to think. You may not be able to prove the solution in those 2 minutes, but you can certainly identify it. The information you are seeking is located not in the sum, but in the equation. The equation being, of course, multiplication. The basis of operation is, of course, the number 12. The command given to every patriarch from Adam on is to be fruitful and to multiply. The thing you need to be aware of is that in the kingdom of heaven, multiplication is an inexact science. In the parable of the sower, Jesus said, speaking of the seed that fell on the good ground, some brought forth 30, some 60, and some 100-fold. Multiples. In terms of human multiplication, whether the multiplication of children or produce or wealth or power, the multiplying effect is directly relative to the ability, effort, skill, and desire of the ones doing the multiplying. Some families multiply by 1 or 2 children per generation, while others multiply by 5, 8, 10, or 12 children per generation. Obviously, the results are not uniform. Some people grow gardens. Others sow 15, 50, or 100-acre farms. Obviously, the results are not uniform. Some people are content with the wealth produced by a job paying hourly wages. Others produce more by hiring others to do the work for their money. The ones who multiply wealth most are those who make their money work for them. Obviously, the results are not uniform. Virtually everybody describes power in different terms. Intellectual power, earning power, productive power, the power of persuasion, the power of fists, the power of guns, the power of bombs. Obviously, the results are not uniform. The other clue on this particular venture is found in the middle of verse 8. There is not, and there never has been, any such thing as the tribe of Joseph. Joseph was in Egypt while his brothers were in the process of multiplying, and he did not marry a Hebrew. His wife was Egyptian. Furthermore, Joseph died in Egypt a century before the Exodus, when there was no such thing as the tribes of Israel. The families of the 12 brothers came to be known as the tribes of Israel in the process of the Exodus. Joseph's inheritance was divided between his 2 sons, who came to be known as the half-tribes of Manasseh and Ephraim. Obviously, the term tribe of Joseph is used here in order to have a perfect 12 as the basis of operation, as opposed to the 11 and 2 half-tribes of Israel, primarily because the result would not be the same. Manasseh is a much smaller tribe than Ephraim. What you are to take away from this is that these 144,000 of all the tribes of Israel are the recipients of the fulfillment of the promise to rescue a remnant made in the ending chapters of Deuteronomy, because the Lord would remember his covenant with Abraham, and that these recipients are the products of multiplication within and among the 12 tribes of Israel. The actual number of people to find refuge in Palestine prior to the war between 1886 and 1939 is truly about 163,000. The point was made with regard to multiplication, and the actual number of rescued shows Revelation 7:4 to be a pretty decent estimate, made at a distance of 1900 years. As an aside, the Jewish population in Palestine stood somewhere between 70,000 and 75,000 in 1914. By 1939, it stood at roughly 163,000. So, Obviously, at some point, there were actually 144,000 Jews in Palestine. If, in the mind of God, there was some historical transition to take place upon the precise gathering of 144,000 of them, I don't know what it was. I don't believe this is the case, though. As I said before, I don't think the sum of 144,000 is significant. The equation of multiplication is the object of instruction here. For those of you who are familiar with the sabbatical law of Jubilee, it should be of particular interest that the beginning of Jews finding refuge in Palestine was 1889, 50 years before the doors were closed. On Tubi TV, there is a documentary about the building of the first all-Jewish National Orchestra of Israel. You should read Matthew 22, 1-14, and then watch that documentary. Jesus did not engage in hyperbole. His prophecies, his parables, and his commands are not to be taken lightly. Jesus' every word was stated on purpose, with purpose. You have the demonstrated fulfillment of the Lord's prophecies, and you have the example of both the obedient and the careless of Israel's people. As has been pointed out previously, the time is short. Are you watching? Are you listening? Are you determined to hear the voice of the Lord and to obey? Or will you simply follow the crowd into the mouth of destruction? The gate that leads to life is straight and it is narrow, and there be few that find that good way. The road leading to destruction is wide and varied, and many there be that go in thereat. If you boil that statement down to gravy and state it as simply as possible, the Lord was telling you anything that everyone is doing is always going to be the wrong thing. Of the millions of Jews in the earth, only 163,000 found their promised rescue from the Holocaust, and the forecast for the Gentiles in the final outpouring does not look any better. Many are called, few are chosen. Are you determined to be one of them? Either the Word will keep you from sin, or sin will keep you from the Word. Choose you this day whom you will serve. Next time, we'll dig into the Revelation chapter 8 and become acquainted with the 7 angels, the 7 trumpets, and the 7 thunders. Again, I have developed an alphabetical listing of the rules of prophetic interpretation as given in the scripture, and you are welcome to have a copy. Just email me a request at thehandofhistory@gmail.com. I'll see you next time. For now, keep your eyes on the prize. I'm Johnny. Bye.